Coming back to Atlanta really is a very nostalgic and very gratifying experience for me, because it was not just a transition in our personal lives. Our first daughter was born here, and I was found by NBC after I'd been at WSB not very long, and after 15 months I went to Los Angeles to begin my career with the network and caught another wave because I began covering the rise of Ronald Reagan and all the turmoil of the 60s in California. But when I came to Atlanta as a northerner, and God only knows why they hired this 25-year-old white boy to be the 11 o'clock anchorman. I just still don't understand why. But I came in with an open mind about the South and wanted to understand the culture and understand the region and understand the literature. And it was, I'm here to tell you, one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. I wasn't here all that long, but I was able to kind of decode the South in a way. Now, there was a lot of things that I had to learn right off the bat because I was on the air. It's not Houston, it's Houston. It's not Ponce de Leon, it's Ponce de Leon. I never did acquire a taste for grits, but butter beans with a little fat back in the spring was about as good as it could get when you're on the family table. In the course of this book, I write about one of your great citizens, in my judgment, Tom Cousins, and what he's done with the Eastlake Foundation. Let me just take a few moments and back up and tell you about why I wrote the book. And it really is rooted in my experience in Atlanta, because I was in the South when this region and this city particularly were in a historic transition. But Dr. King was able to do with the power of his belief and to do it in a nonviolent fashion as he marched across the South and as he placed his trust in the rule of law in America. Changed us. And it changed us profoundly, because everyone was liberated from the shackles of racial discrimination. We put that shameful part of our history behind us and went on from there. And as I tell young audiences now, Dr. King did all that without tweeting, without a cell phone, without text messages, and without a website. He somehow managed to mobilize not just this part of the world, but across the country, to expose the hypocrisy of the North as well, where racial segregation was every bit as deep and every bit as bitter in the northern industrial areas of America. And we became a better people for that. So that was a profound challenge for the country that we met, we understood, moved on, and were strengthened by it. When the 60s came and Dr. King was killed and Bobby Kennedy was killed and 16,000 people died in Vietnam, our fellow Americans that year, black and white and Hispanic of all color, that was a terribly challenging time for our society as well. But we emerged from it because at the end of the day, people of goodwill were still willing to talk to each other. They didn't retreat to far corners of the room and only shout at one another. There were the dramatic street demonstrations, no question about it. Campuses went up. But at the end of the day, the wise leadership of the country would find a way to move forward. And we were able to do that. Now, we are at another defining time in our lives. And the conditions are, no question about it, are perilous for the underpinning of what we've all come to believe in. Wherever I go in this country now, I am encountering a question I had never, ever heard before. It goes to the heart of the American dream. Parents and grandparents come up to me and say, I'm just so worried that my children or grandchildren will not have the lives that we've had. The presumption has always been that succeeding generations will have a better life. And that's what helped start this book and got me thinking about it, because I am a grandparent as well. And I looked at my grandchildren and I thought, what kind of a life and a world will my generation be leaving them? What are the challenges for their parents, who are now in their 40s, as they try to construct their piece of the American dream? What are the objective conditions that exist in the world now that we have to take on, all of us, whatever we believe philosophically, politically, whatever our faith, whatever we do for a living, whatever part of the country we happen to occupy? Just as the generation that I wrote about, the greatest generation, faced an enormous challenge coming out of the Great Depression when everything was about sacrifice and deprivation. Then they were asked to go thousands of miles across the Pacific and thousands of miles across the Atlantic and fight the two greatest wars that had ever occurred in the history of mankind, at whom everyone gave up the luxuries and the comforts of everyday life to make enormous sacrifices to make sure that the war machine could be as efficient as possible. And in the wisdom of the Congress before the war was over, Republicans and Democrats alike, even though we were in a deep in debt to finance the war, decided that when the war was over, to rebuild itself, America would have to have a better education system. And they created the GI Bill of Rights, which was one of the great transformational acts of the 20th century. Men and women who never expected to go to college came home and became engineers and scientists and doctors and lawyers and entrepreneurs and artists. They gave us new industries and new institutions, and they built states like Georgia and Florida across the South as well. And they gave us the lives that we have today. And so no wonder that at the end of the 20th century, we could look back and say that was the American century. Now the question is, what will they say at the end of the 21st century about all of us? What is our legacy? What have we left behind? What are the objective conditions that exist out there that we really have to address with a kind of sense of urgency? I began to think about that more profoundly when I was in Dresden, Germany, in the spring of 2009, waiting to interview President Obama, our first African-American president, in a city that had been firebombed to within an inch of its life during World War II, and then spent the next 40 years behind the communist lines. But now it was rebuilding itself, coming up out of the German soil, determined to reclaim its old title of the Florence of Central Europe. I had just come from Berlin, and as I told the president, you know, I was there the night the wall came down. It's such a cosmopolitan city now, but it was such a difference between the night when I was there and the wall came down and we didn't know what to expect. He said, "Oh, I remember, Tom, when you were there. I was in law school at the time." And I thought, oh my God. He was on his way to Dachau with Elie Wiesel, the site of the Holocaust. And then to Normandy, the greatest invasion in the history of mankind that helped save the world. And then to come home to America to a broken economy and uncertain political future. And the confluence of all those events, both at that time and in my own life, prompted me to try to think about how do we get through this together? How do I, as a journalist and as a citizen who has seen a fair amount, try to synthesize the challenges that are before us so that we can have the common ground that I think most of us long for? And I walk us through education first, because that will be the currency of the 21st century. You've had a painful experience here in Atlanta in the last year with education in your public education system. But Tom Cousins has also shown that there are other ways to look at education and what you can do and provide hope for the lower socioeconomic classes. Across the country, you're seeing more public and private partnerships and charter schools rising up, and the place of public schools and teachers' unions, that's now open to debate, and it's a healthy dialogue that we are having. But it requires, as I say, the best efforts of all of us, because these students in the inner city cannot be left behind. First of all, it's unjust, and secondly, given what we face in the world, it's going to take the best efforts of all of us. We're going to have to develop a workforce that has a skill set. You can't have, as we do now, students coming out of high school across the board in America, and those going to college have to take remedial courses in math and English just to understand how to compete in the modern workplace. So that's a place to begin. And it's a place that all of us had as a foundation for whatever success that we've had in life. And I suggest that my generation get back involved. Now we're at this stage as tutors or find ways to be part of our school system, as we once were in America. Then I talk as well about housing and proportion and making sure that we can get back to a time when people have a savings account We now have a negative savings account across America. Thrift for too many families has gone out the window. They're held hostage in a home that's underwater, or they're hostage to credit card debt. And we need to have that dialogue from the ground up and from the bottom down. I had lunch with one of my daughters yesterday. She has a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and she said, you know, I've already introduced them the idea of what money's about, how much things cost, and how you should try to save at the end of every week. She said, when we were growing up, you know, you and Mom for the first time had money, and even though we led a more Spartan life compared to our friends, we didn't talk enough in the family about that, about what we need to do to plan as individuals and within families. And then I talk about us as a society, about what we have allowed to happen. We're still in the 2 longest wars in American history, 10 years apiece, Afghanistan and Iraq. We have sent less than 1% of our population to take 100% of the bullets. Working class and middle class kids from neighborhoods not too far from here, but not from the penthouse at the Commerce Club, raised their hands and volunteered to serve their country and paid a terrible price in many instances. They came home physically gravely wounded or psychologically damaged, or they came home in body bags. That is not just unjust, that's immoral for a democratic society. To send less than 1% of its population to war, well, nothing was asked of the rest of us. We made no sacrifices in the last 10 years, individually or collectively as a country. We didn't learn the lesson of Vietnam that there is a price to be paid for guns and butter. Moreover, you can't have a nation going to war in the interest of national security if we're not all involved in some fashion. So we need to find a way to connect to those families who still have people there, and especially to those who are coming home for what is now called reintegration. They've been warriors for 10 years. Excuse me. And they're coming back to a broken economy and a different kind of requirement. Thank you. I know there's always iced tea when I come to Atlanta. They're coming home to a broken economy, and they're coming home to a different demand in the workplace. And we owe it to them to find a place for them, not just in terms of their professions or their hopes as workers, but also as neighbors and as friends. There are lots of organizations out there, and what I'm trying to do with a number of people, including Stan McChrystal, who now has a presidential appointment to work on this. Mike Mullen, the recently retired chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said, I'm going to spend the rest of my days working on reintegration and finding a way to close the gap between the civilian society and the uniformed society. Now, Atlanta, when I come to the airport, I always know there's going to be somebody out there with a banner saying, welcome home, here we are. And I think that's great, but we got to get beyond that. It's not enough to just say, thanks, buddy, for all you've done. We really have to, in a profound way, find a personal connection to them. I've been writing and talking about this for some time, and by the way, it did grow out of my greatest generation experiences, but it also grew out of the fact that as a reporter, I was embedded in Afghanistan and Iraq with these units. And I saw not just how brave they were, but how competent they were in every possible way. You know, that they could learn the language, that they were sociologists as well as warriors, that were going into communities, and they were trying to help them with their hearts and minds equation. And I kept thinking, they've got the Pentagon behind them, but what about the civilian population? So one of the things I suggest in the book is that we need to raise the bar on public service in America, and I propose 6 public service academies to put another face on America and the world and to meet some of the needs that we have here at home.